Hi, I'm Jason, and I'm a surrealist painter. I usually create dramatic scenes often contain butterflies, like these. In this video, I'll be taking you through the process of drawing and painting a butterfly. We'll be using this reference that I took a couple years ago. It's of a painted lady butterfly that I actually raised. In this video, I'll be walking you through the entire process of the painting, including the drawing. But if you want to, feel free to skip ahead using the timestamps. I'll have the reference as well as a printout of the final drawing linked in the description so you can trace the drawing or follow the entire process. I'll include a section on how to transfer the drawing later in the video so you can get right into painting. Now let's get you set up with some materials. I'm using this mechanical pencil and Nano Zero mechanical eraser, but any pencil and eraser will do. I'll be drawing on top of this 140-pound watercolor paper from Fabriano, which I've taped to the board with masking tape. I'll have all the supplies I'll be using today linked in the description below. A good way to start a complicated drawing is to work from basic shapes. Don't think about all the curves and edges of the entire silhouette, but simplify them down to the simplest of shapes to start with. That way you can more easily get proportions or perspective right when drawing before moving on to the final details. As you'll see here, I've divided this image into a few ovals and some rounded triangles for the wings. Now let's start drawing. Depending on your confidence level, you might want to start drawing lightly using very little pencil pressure, so it's easier to erase if you make mistakes. Start by transferring your basic shapes onto the paper. Keep note of all the angles and lengths for each section. If you're using this reference, make sure that you're looking at it at about the same size as you want your drawing to be. If your reference appears larger on your screen or paper, your brain can often exaggerate lengths and sizes to make it match what you're seeing, so try to work at a similar size. It's always a good idea in drawing to work from general to specific. If you started drawing on the smallest of details first, you might end up finding that the proportions are off as you start drawing the larger sections, causing you to have to erase or rework more often. Now that you have the basic shapes drawn in, take a look at your reference and start to notice the difference between your drawing and the reference. At this point, you should start to refine the silhouette of the butterfly, chiseling in or extending outward along the edge, following your reference as a guide. With a solid foundation, this should help keep things in proportion. At this point, I'm still holding back from the final level of detail, still honoring that general to specific workflow. Here, I've passed general, having gotten in the basic shapes, and am now moving on to a step somewhere in between general and specific, still not having rendered out everything entirely. When you're happy with the silhouette, it's time to start the interior of the butterfly. Now there are a lot of shapes and lines that can make this part feel overwhelming, so I like to start by drawing some guiding lines. Thankfully, butterflies have some lines built in that we can use to help figure out where these shapes are placed. Every butterfly has veins on their wings. This diagram helps to illustrate that pattern. Since the veins on the butterflies generally follow the same pattern, I like to use this as a reference for drawing these construction lines. While we might not see these lines in the final drawing, think of them as scaffolding when engineers construct a building. With the veins in place, I can start to draw in the shapes that make up the pattern on the butterfly's wings. Here, it's important to use the veins as guiding lines to help inform the placement of this pattern. Remember that butterfly wings are symmetrical. A line placed on one side should be in the same space on the other. If you see a shape or a dot within a section of vein on a reference, go ahead and place it there. Drawing is all about training yourself to see and analyze things, using reference points like the veins to guide your mark making. Comparing and measuring is going to be an important process in making this drawing look realistic. There are several methods for doing this, but when working on something small like this, I find that positive and negative space measurements to be the most useful. Especially when learning not to rely on literal measuring tools like a ruler to get shapes in proportion, learning how to approximate shape and size with your eyes is going to be important. This is a famous example of positive and negative space. It's an image where when you look at the positive space, the subject itself, you see a vase. But when you look at the negative space, the space around the subject, you see two faces. Positive and negative space are not related to the worth of the piece, but rather the way we look at space. When measuring with positive and negative space, there are two ways to look at it: the length within the positive space and the length within the negative space to another object. What I mean is that you should look at not only this length, but this length as well, when trying to draw this vase accurately. This method helps to remind you to measure things in multiple ways, comparing lines with various reference points to get closer to accuracy. Remember that art takes time. It doesn't need to be rushed. Take your time and enjoy the process. If you're early on in your art journey, give yourself some grace. If something isn't turning out the way you want, you can always erase and try again. If it's still not working, step back for a bit and come back with fresh eyes. I'm often active in my Discord community if you'd like to get feedback, and I also offer private art tutoring lessons if you need some more one-on-one support. At this point in the drawing, it's time to start on the finer details. This will be everything that will help guide you through the smallest of mark making when it comes to the painting process. In this piece, it's the smaller patterns on the edge of the wing consisting of small dots and arrow shapes. Even in this stage of the painting, it's still a good technique to think about things in terms of basic shapes. You don't always need to brute force your way through drawing shapes perfectly, when you could also break up things into smaller, more manageable portions. There's a nearly infinite amount of details that you could refine in this stage. One could even go so far as to draw each individual scale on the butterfly's wings, but that's not necessarily the point here. The key is simplification. Make what might be a jagged or rough edge and find the general curve or shape to the line. You don't need to draw each scale, but think about how the edge between shapes might have a texture and simplify that in the drawing. It's only when we start to paint that you'll need to worry about the texture of these edges. Don't overcomplicate the process. Use guides if they help. If you're new, don't hesitate to lean on my drawing or the photo reference. If you're still struggling with placement, you can use a straight edge. Keep your reference and your drawing at roughly the same size, then align the straight edge across both to compare positions. This can help you map out where elements should be on the page. From there, lightly mark a few dots to indicate the placement of shapes before going in to refine the drawing. You're also totally welcome to skip this step and move straight into transferring the drawing if you just want to get right into painting. Especially if you're a beginner artist, the goal is not to be able to draw a masterpiece right off the bat. You're allowed to use tools to help you. The idea is that over time you start to develop your hand-eye coordination and observational skills more and more so that these tools become less needed over time. As long as you make sure not to rely on these tools too much, you'll develop these skills over time. For those who are looking to jump right into the painting, here's the steps for transferring the drawing. Again, I'll have the photo reference and my drawing linked in the description. First, print out the drawing. Cut around the edges to fit the paper more easily, then apply a thin layer of graphite powder to the back of the paper. You can also use vine charcoal or simply fill in the back with a layer of pencil. Then flip the paper back over and stick it to the paper you want to transfer it to. Start to trace over the image with a red pen. The pressure from the pen will help transfer the graphite onto the paper. Using a red color also helps indicate where you've already drawn. The image will most likely be fairly light depending on the amount of graphite you applied to the back of your reference, but even with a thin coat, it's still visible. Now that you have your drawing complete, let's talk about painting supplies. For this painting, I'll be using two brushes, this Princeton Select Round No. 3 to paint larger areas, and this Princeton Velvetouch script liner for fine detail. But honestly, any small watercolor brush and liner should work just fine. Now for paints. I'll be using a selection of M.Graham Gouache paints consisting of titanium white, ivory black, azo yellow, yellow ochre, and quinacridone red. Other supplies you'll need is a jar of water for mixing and cleaning your brushes, and a spray bottle to help saturate dried paint. You'll also need some paper towel and a mixing surface like a plate or a watercolor palette. I use an old Spirograph tin with a hinging lid to keep my paints from drying out between sessions. On your mixing surface, I recommend putting down a moist towel to place your paints on top of. This will help keep them from drying out while you work. Go ahead and organize your paints on the palette in any order you like. I usually put white and black on opposite sides and the warm colors towards the bottom, but my layout is fairly arbitrary. With your brush, start mixing together a combination of yellow and red to get a nice orange that matches the orange on the butterfly's wings. Try to add little bits at a time to get closer and closer to the right color. I like to imagine that mixing colors is like weighing things on those old-fashioned scales. If you're trying to balance something on one of those scales, you wouldn't put a boulder on one side. You'd probably start out by using pebbles to approach a color balance. Especially if you aren't used to the strength of certain colors, it's best to add little bits at a time. Once you've gotten the right hue or the color on the color wheel, I'll go in and adjust the value and the saturation, the color's lightness or darkness, and the color intensity. For this orange, I'm noticing that it's not as brilliant as the color straight out of the tube, so I'm desaturating it by adding little bits of black and white to gray it out slightly. Again, I'm not putting in boulders of black or white, I'm just using a few pebbles to slightly adjust the saturation. Typically, when you desaturate colors, you would add the complementary color, but for the purposes of this video, I wanted to keep a limited palette. Make sure to mix a little bit of water into your mixture to help it flow. Just like with watercolor paint, we'll be starting with thin washes and building up. At this point, your wash should be the consistency of coffee or milk. Go ahead and start filling in the orange spaces on the painting. Again, like with watercolor, we're working from light to dark, building up the lightest colors before moving on to the darks. With the white parts of the butterfly, we'll be using a technique called reserved white, leaving those spaces without any color so that the white of the paper can shine through as the whites. It's only when you need to make some adjustments that we'll use the white gouache later on to fix things. With a solid foundational drawing, these initial steps of the painting process should feel like paint by numbers. For the most part, if you see a color in a particular section of the wing, go ahead and add it there. It's okay if you're a little messy in the stage or go over the lines. The dark colors will easily cover up any mistakes. One of the benefits of using gouache is that it gives a soft mottled effect like watercolor, while also allowing you to layer like acrylic. For this section, let the paint stay a little bit washy to create a nice sense of texture. Gouache can easily start to look a little flat when layered heavily, so try to treat some of these areas a little more like watercolor to keep the surface feeling dynamic. Now let's paint the darker parts on the inside of the wing. Let's make a milk-like consistency paint mixture of black, a little white, and some yellow ochre to get a grayish-brown color. Now I know we talked about working from light to dark, but don't worry, there's a technique we can use a little later to bring back some of the lighter colors on top of this section. Right now I'm trying to capture the color of the shadows under the fuzzy parts close to the body. Again, work in thin washes here. You can always add more, but you can't always take away washes, so there's no need to rush into the final coat. If you recall from my previous video about gouache, it's important to work in layers, starting from thin coats and getting progressively thicker with each coat, eventually using paint straight from the tube. This is an important rule to follow because thin coats on top of thicker coats will just pick up the paint layer below. In most cases, it's always a good practice to start with thin coats. Now grab some black paint again and make a new pile. This will be for the dark parts on the outside of the wings. Even though I know this section is black and could reasonably use the final thickness here, I'm still working a little thinner in case I need to go back and add things over the top. As you'll see later, I did have to go back and adjust some of the white dots on the wings, so not going the full thickness here was important. With the small details on the hind wings, you can start to use the liner brush to more easily color in these small shapes. The long bristles help to soak up the paint, so it's important to find a brush that has this. You'll find that when saturated with paint, it comes to a fine tip, and depending on how much pressure you apply, you can get thinner or thicker lines. I plan to add some highlights to the wings, so I lightened the orange color from before with some white. Making sure that the layer is a little thicker than the orange below, I was able to paint over the top of the orange without any issue. This will leave a section of paint with a sharp outline. Take a slightly damp brush and gently brush around the outside of this new shape. The little bit of moisture on the brush should be enough to agitate the topmost layer without agitating the layer below, softening these sharp edges. If you find that it's still picking up the layer underneath, your brush might have just a little too much water on it. Make sure to do this while the top layer is relatively wet, as this will most likely pick up all layers of paint if it's completely dry. As a result, if you're planning to blend colors in this way, make sure to work quickly. Just like with the drawing, we're also working general to specific here. We started with the largest areas working more generally, and now we're starting on some of the more specific details. Now the shapes on the wings don't always have straight edges and are often textured because of the overlapping of scales. For this we can use a dry brushing technique. Get some paint onto the brush and dab out most of the water content onto a paper towel. Then drag the edge of the brush up the edge of the black to get a textured effect. You can certainly paint these textures by hand, but it's much more useful to use the dry brushing technique to let the brush naturally create the jagged edge along the transition from black to orange. It's called dry brushing because without water on the brush, the paint will skip across the surface and deposit paint irregularly, creating the exact effect we want. Add this everywhere you see a rough or jagged transition from black to orange. Now let's create the warm highlights and hairy textures on the innermost part of the wing and body. I'm starting with a combination of red, yellow ochre, a little bit of black, and a good portion of white to lighten it up. This will make a slightly grayed out beige color. The mixture should have slightly less water than the layer before, moving towards the heavy cream consistency. Again, let's use the dry brushing technique to let the brush do most of the work in making the texture. Pick up some paint and dab off the excess water. This time use the side of the brush to get a wider contact area. You could also use a wider flat brush to get this effect too. Pull the brush across the surface in the direction of the texture. I'll also scrub along the whole area with the brush just to give a variety of textures here. Now with a little more white, with no additional water, I'll make a mixture that's a little lighter. Grabbing my number 3 round, I'll pick up some paint and dab off the little bit of water that's left. This time make strokes radiating from the base of the wings. This will indicate that the texture of the hairs are growing out from the base. Press and lift towards the end of the brush stroke to give a tapered effect, as if the hairs are getting thinner as they extend out. You can alternatively continue with the liner brush and paint each individual hair. I just like the variety of textures that this method gives. Now with some red, yellow ochre, and black, let's make a reddish brown color. You could certainly use a burnt sienna color right from the tube to save yourself some time here. This color will be for the butterfly's eyes and the warm hairs right behind its head. You can also color in the palps on the butterfly's head. These are scaly mouthpieces that look like horns. They help the butterfly taste food. I wasn't happy with the hair on the wings, so I came back with a darker mixture, adding some black to the grayish beige color paint from before. Using the liner, I painted in some individual hairs and shadows. Now with a light beige color, you can add some highlights to the abdomen, following the lighting you're seeing in the reference. Then, with a dark mixture, go through and add the vein patterns that you drew earlier. After some last bit of shading to clean up some areas, you can paint in the antenna. For mine, I wasn't too happy with the shapes on the white dots on the edge of the wings, so I went back with some white paint straight from the tubes to change these up a bit. I ended up realizing I messed up the placement on one of these dots and had to cover up and repaint it, which I think turned out okay in the end. Before I fixed that, I moved on to the white dashes along the entire edge of the wing, using my liner brush to get thin lines. Again, I used paint right from the tube since this is pretty much the final layer. In the end, I went back again and added some highlights to the innermost part of the wings, just to make it pop a little bit more. And with all that in place, you should be finished with your painted lady butterfly painting in gouache. Congratulations. I had a blast with this piece, and I hope you had fun following along. If you like this format, let me know in the comments below and I'll consider doing another, especially if there's another medium or subject you'd like to see. Anyway, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.